Hi everyone. As alluded to in the last video, today we're taking a look at the arcade classic Rampage. Rampage is definitely an original title, and other than its sequels, I can't really think of anything off the top of my head quite like it, except for maybe King of the Monsters. But that's an extreme stretch, since the destruction of the cities in those games is more of a side effect of the fighting between the monsters. What is Rampage? Assuming you've been living under a rock for the last 35 years? Simply put, Rampage is a game where you tour the nation, destroying every city you come to as one of three giant monsters, directly influenced by classic monster movies like Godzilla, King Kong, and the Wolfman. Being a popular arcade title at the time, Rampage was ported to just about every 8-bit console and computer imaginable, all of varying qualities. For this video, we'll just be focusing on the Master System version, as you would expect, but there is video out there of all the other versions, and having looked at what it looks like on the other systems, I've got to say this version is probably the best console port until the later Midway collections were released on more recent consoles that allowed for pixel-perfect conversions. And as I love to when it's appropriate, the NES version looks especially bad in comparison to the Master System version. And the NES version is missing a character too. Really, guys? Okay, so I'm saying pretty good things about this release so far, so that means it's got to be at least a 4 or maybe even a 5-star review, right? Slow down a bit. We're talking about a port of a somewhat simplistic arcade game. But maybe. Let's take a closer look.
So right off the bat, I'm sure you're asking, are you sure this is a Master System game? Due to its non-standard box art. Well, yes it is. And the reason for the non-standard art is that this is the first of 4 Master System titles we'll eventually look at released by Activision. I guess as you can see down here. Third-party titles were somewhat rare on the Master System due to Nintendo's unfair business practices at the time, and these 4 Activision titles stand out by having colorful covers that still reference the usual Master System style with the cross-hatching. You can see here the red background and the yellow to go with the red and yellow in Rampage. Also, you'll notice the old school Activision rainbow logo here. Common sight for anyone that grew up with the Atari 2600. The case is in pretty good shape, as you can see here. Although it's missing the hang tab. As we open it up, you'll definitely see that, unfortunately, the cartridge label has seen better days. Most of it's intact, but you're definitely missing this chunk over here on the left side. It's kind of annoying, but at least it works, and the rest of the package here is intact. I might eventually try to just replace the cartridge just to get one with a better label, but right now it's not a priority. Interestingly enough, the copies I looked at on eBay, they all had similar label issues over here on the left side, so I'm just wondering if that's possibly a manufacturing defect. Maybe the glue wasn't good on the left side or whatever. You can even see like a little bit's come off on over here on the right corner too. If you take a look at the manual, you can immediately see that it's a little different than your usual Master System manual, but it still conforms to the same usual blue and white that you would see for any of the Master System manuals. Just for reference, here, as I pull this down, here's a non-Master System, or non-Activision Master System manual. And as you look at them, you can tell that there's definitely, like the blue is slightly different. If you know, it might be a little hard to tell on the camera here, but this blue is definitely like a darker blue. Anyway, when we look at the manual, it's in decent shape. You got a little bending up here on the corner, but other than that, it's intact. There's not a whole lot here. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, basically, 8 pages total. Granted, it's a single player. I mean, excuse me, it's a two-player arcade game from 1986. So there's not exactly a whole lot to explain, so the manual is not going to be very big. But you would think that, like some of the, let me see if this one has it. Some of the other, yeah. So what's sort of standard on the older Master System manuals is they'd have the scorebook section here where you could like write down high scores and name and date of when you got them, whatever. And that's not here. And also, there's no graphics at all either, except for like this one picture representing a Master System controller. So it still seems pretty bare bones. I think the review is probably going to be similarly short in comparison to the manual. Because there's just not a whole lot to discuss. I mean, Rampage isn't the most complicated game in the world. But, let's go ahead and get to it and quit wasting time here. As previously mentioned, Rampage is an action game where you take control of a larger-than-life monster and go on a city destruction spree, the likes of which are not usually seen outside of Hollywood. Released originally in the arcades in 1986, the Master System version showed up a bit later in January of 1989 in the United States. The arcade version was a bit unusual, as it supported 3 simultaneous players, which was part of its charm. That many players on a home console was relatively unheard of at the time, but Activision Sega did manage to make a perfectly playable 2-player version of the game that supported the choice between all 3 characters. There's no real difference between Ralph the Wolf, George the Ape, or Lizzie the Lizard, at least in the Master System version. Supposedly Ralph punches the hardest, George climbs the best, and Lizzie is the fastest in both the arcade and this version. But at least as far as this version goes, I found that they're all pretty much palette swaps. Maybe I'm wrong, but I played through the game with both Lizzie and George, and I couldn't really tell the difference. Speaking of playing the game, the Master System version is slightly different than the arcade version in that regard. In the arcade version, you go on a 128-day tour of destruction visiting various cities throughout North America. After passing through all 128 cities, the tour repeats 5 more times, and then after the last city, you start back at level 1 again, never really having an end. The Master System version instead replaces the 128 city tour with 10 major cities: San Francisco, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Dallas, St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. Each of the cities has 5 areas to destroy, for a total of 50 levels to complete. And I do mean complete, because as opposed to the arcade version, there is an ending after completing the 50th level. It's not much, but it's something, and it's a nice touch. What does playing through the game entail for those 50 levels? Well, as already stated, you pretty much take a monster and wreak havoc across the land. How do you do that? Well, each area has between 3 and 5 buildings that need to be destroyed to complete that level. Buildings are destroyed by climbing up them and punching holes in the buildings until they crumble. Technically, they can also be damaged by jumping on top of them, and waiting for an enemy to set a bomb at the base of the building. But the most common way is punching. Lots and lots of punching. However, the military and police won't just sit around while you destroy major cities. So as you go through an area, you'll have to contend with enemies that pop out of the windows in the buildings to shoot or throw dynamite at you. Also, helicopters fly around shooting at you, and tanks and armored police cars drive across the map attempting to take you out with heavy artillery. It's in your best interest to balance destroying the buildings with destroying your enemies. You won't be able to avoid all enemy fire, it's just not that sort of game, and enemies will continue to spawn as time passes, so it's not a matter of clearing out a level to make it safe for destruction. You can also regain health by eating enemies, other bystanders from the buildings, and certain items in the buildings. However, you must be careful of items grabbed, as only certain ones are edible, and others will cause you to lose health. For instance, if you see a toaster, don't grab it. Instead, wait for it to produce toast. You also have to be careful not to attack electric signs on the sides of the building, as that will just get you electrocuted and falling off the building, resulting in another health drop. This, along with your death animation, where you unmutate back to your naked human form, and the dumb grin on your character has when it breaks the fourth wall and looks at the camera when you're not moving, are examples of the game's sense of humor, where it never takes itself too seriously. Humor is something that's definitely severely lacking in many video games, so it's always nice when it shows up, and definitely adds to the level of entertainment given. As you can imagine based on my description so far, Rampage isn't exactly what you'd call a deep game. Climb a building, punch. Climb another building, punch. Jump, destroy a helicopter or tank. Repeat for 50 levels. Considering it's based on an arcade game from 1986, you would expect that lack of depth, but it does impact replayability, or the lack thereof. After beating the game, which probably won't take more than 2 hours due to having continues, there's not really any reason to play through the game again, unless you want to do it with a different character, but since all the characters play exactly the same, and the ending is the same regardless of who you beat the game with, I don't really know why you'd want to do that. I suppose you can try to play and set a high score, and if you're playing in 2-player mode, being the one to set that high score gives you a bit of bragging rights. I haven't really mentioned 2-player mode, because there's not really a lot to mention. It operates exactly like single-player mode. However, you can hit each other with friendly fire, so be careful of that. But otherwise, you progress through the game in exactly the same manner, except now you're teaming up to destroy buildings. 2-player mode does add a slight bit of replay, but I can see it getting old very quickly as well. The original arcade version doesn't have the most impressive visuals in the world, but they're good enough to play the game and be able to tell what's going on. For the most part, the Master System version is a faithful representation of the arcade version from a graphical perspective. Obviously, it's not pixel perfect, but it's close. Character and enemy animations are good, and most of the little details made the trip from the arcade to home. The in-game sound is probably the least impressive part of the game. Rampage supports the optional FM add-on, and from what I've listened to online, it does sound a little bit better. But most people playing the original cartridge won't be listening to that soundtrack. And even with that slightly enhanced soundtrack, it's still nothing special and fairly repetitive, much less than on an FM soundtrack. There's very few sound effects as well, and most of the game will be played in relative silence aside from the background music. This is definitely one of those games where you can mute the TV and add your own soundtrack, and you'll miss nothing. Not exactly a selling point. With as good an arcade conversion of Rampage as this is, it's not perfect, and the original is more or less a basic quarter muncher to begin with. As a result, I'm giving Rampage a 3, due to the fact it's an authentic conversion of the arcade machine, and it's better than the versions that came out for most of the other consoles at the time, other than the more powerful home computers like the Amiga and the Atari ST. I didn't want to give it a 2 because I think that would indicate that the game was poor in some way, and it's not. It's just an old game from a different time, not designed for a deep play experience.
Okay, so that was Rampage. Not the longest video in the world, but for some of these older titles, there's only so much you can say about them without really getting into boring, mundane minutiae. Where do we go from here? I think it's time for another racing game. But not an arcade title this time. Maybe something with motorcycles and bats. So until next time, remember, whatever you play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!